Thank you very much for giving me this award. I'm delighted to accept it, and I hope that you'll enjoy this lecture, which is about the neurology of apathy and motivation. Before I start, I'd like to thank the Wellcome Trust, who've kindly been supporting us for the last 20 years, and also thank a whole host of colleagues who've been absolutely integral to what I'm going to show you next. So I guess we all know people who lack motivation, either in our family, our friends, colleagues, and perhaps it was captured best by this character called Oblomov, a character created by the Russian novelist Ivan Goncharov. Now, Oblomov is a man who has inherited an estate, but he's also a man who is extremely apathetic. So while his estate is going to rack and ruin, dear old Oblomov here is lying on his chaise longue, inactive, unable to get himself to make even a simple decision, let alone an action. And his serfs are pulling their hair out because their master is really letting the estate completely go to ruin. And of course, this is an extreme form of apathy in someone who is healthy. But as clinicians, we're also used to seeing people who have pathological apathy. And historically, apathy has been considered using different terms. So, for example, in the psychiatric literature, one might read about avolition, some aspects of anhedonia, or the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. In neurology, we tend to talk about apathy. At more extreme ends, we have abulia or akinetic mutism, people who might not spontaneously make any actions of their own accord or speak, but they're capable of doing both of those things. If someone asks them to do something, they'll do it. If someone speaks to them, they'll speak back. But of their own volition, there's very little self-initiated action or speech. And we are now very familiar with patients who might have bilateral medial frontal lesions, like this stroke reported in a case report in 1953, involving parts of the cingulate cortex, which can lead to this very extreme form of loss of motivation, akinetic mutism. Now, my own familiarization with apathy actually came, must be about 12 or 13 years ago now, when I was at Queen Square, and we received a letter about a patient, an intriguing letter, a man in his 40s, and the GP essentially was saying, I've got this man who unfortunately had a stroke a few months ago. He's recovered physically very well from this stroke, but he seems a completely different person. Whereas he used to be charismatic, very energetic, the center of his social bubble, the kind of person at work who would really galvanize everybody else, now he's doing very little and not really seeming to care very much about it. I thought he was depressed, so I treated him with some antidepressants, but it's not made a difference. And I just wonder whether I'm missing something and whether you can help. It sounded extremely intriguing. And when we looked at his scans, it was even more intriguing because he had these very unusual bilateral focal strokes. So it was a brace of strokes involving parts of the ventral basal ganglia, involving parts of the ventral pallidum. And these kinds of patients are known in the literature. They can develop a condition of profound apathy, sometimes misdiagnosed as depression, following these very small strokes in the basal ganglia. And we saw this guy and became very clear he wasn't depressed. He didn't have any problems about feeling hopeless or lacking any pleasure in life. He enjoyed all those things. It's just he seemed to have lost the motivation to do them. So he was performing so badly at his work that they fired him, but he couldn't be bothered to get unemployment benefit and really couldn't pay the rent for his flat. His friends kindly said, well, why don't you come and stay with us for a little while? And he took up their offer, but I'm sure they regretted it very, very quickly, because what they found was the man they knew who was active, doing lots of things, now was completely inert. He'd sit in a chair all day, doing absolutely nothing, waiting for them to come home so that they would cook for him. He didn't look after himself, wouldn't take a shower, really became quite a shadow of his former self. And this is the kind of patient who's been reported in the literature following these bilateral basal ganglia strokes. Now, to compress a lot of work that's been done, both in the animal literature and also in the clinical literature, we now fully appreciate that lesions of the ventral parts of the basal ganglia, including the ventral striatum, which is essentially the nucleus accumbens in animals, in rodents, can lead to this state of low motivation, as I've shown you, can lesions of the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, including the anterior cingulate. There probably are patients who can have similar kinds of syndromes with more ventromedial prefrontal cortical lesions. And what we know is that there's a complex circuitry that links both the ventral parts of the basal ganglia to the medial frontal cortex, but also links the ventral tegmental area, the area that runs into the substantia nigra, to the ventral parts of the striatum. And this is a complex circuitry which links ventral tegmental area to ventral striatum, and then from there to parts of the ventromedial frontal cortex, and also to the dorsomedial frontal cortex, the anterior cingulate. And what's emerged from this work, which has tried to understand both low states of motivation, like apathy, and high states of motivation, for example, impulsivity and addiction, is that the brain's reward circuit, as it's been called, is probably integral to both those types of syndromes. And in addition, because of this link between the ventral tegmental area and the ventral striatum, dopamine has been identified as a key neurotransmitter in both high levels of motivation in impulsive disorders, but also here in apathy in low levels of motivation. And with this in mind, we tried to treat our patient with the bilateral basal ganglia lesions with levodopa. We really found very little change, either clinically or on experimental measures of reward sensitivity. So we took him off that, and instead we tried a dopamine receptor agonist in the form of ropinirole. And a few months later, this guy was completely changed, and so much so that I was shocked by how much he had been transformed. So now he walked in to see us in a suit. He'd had his hair cut, and he'd also managed to get a job, which was amazing. And the most impressive thing of all, he also had managed to get a girlfriend. And this is a man who had never really looked like he was going to meet anyone, because he spent all of his time at home doing nothing. And of course, this was, really amazing for us as clinicians seeing him, but it made me think about whether he is actually a very interesting model for more common forms of apathy, because someone like him is extremely rare, just as someone like a patient with bilateral cingulate lesions is also extremely rare. But what's extremely common is the syndrome of apathy across many brain disorders, which we see frequently. So apathy is a common problem in Parkinson's disease. It varies in various studies between 17 and 70%, depending upon the instrument used to measure it. It's a very common syndrome in Alzheimer's disease. It's also impressively frequent in small vessel cerebrovascular disease, which can lead to vascular dementia. And I'm also mentioning this because I'm going to come back to it later in the talk. It's common in this early onset form of small vessel cerebrovascular disease, a genetic form called CADASIL, and a host of other conventionally neurological diseases. It's known that apathy is a common problem. But I also point to the fact that in the psychiatric literature, if people have used instruments that measure apathy specifically, they've also found that it's quite common. So what does apathy look like? What does a patient with apathy look like? Well, here I'm going to give you some audio of a patient I'm interviewing, and she's a lady who's developed small vessel cerebrovascular disease, and normally she would be running the house. Her husband has been used to her running the household, making sure that he's comfortable for years and years. But now she is a different person. And so here's my interview with her, and when she's referring to him, she's referring to her husband, who's become extremely frustrated because his quality of life is no longer what it used to be. If I was a fly on the wall, watching you at home, what would I see you doing during the day?
I suppose sitting, watching television, which drives him mad. I did used to book read, but I don't seem to be doing that much these days.
Okay.
And that's basically it, really.
So watching the television, yeah. Anything else?
Can't think of anything, really.
In the past, would that have been you?
No.
What would we have seen if we'd been a fly on the wall a few years back? What would we have seen?
Me buzzing around, doing things, going out shopping, coming back, being busy all the time. And I just slowed down and more or less come to a halt, me really.
Yeah. And you said you used to enjoy reading.
Yes.
So what's stopping you reading?
Absolutely nothing. Just that I can't be bothered, I suppose. It's easier to watch a screen and read a book. I keep threatening to pick up a book, but I just don't get there. Some of my students have actually said the same thing. But patients like this, they're not depressed, they lack motivation. Why might that be the case? So a few years ago, we went back to the table and started thinking from first principles and asked ourselves a very simple question. Why is it that we do what we do? What is it that makes us do these things? Why are you listening to me? And we came up with a way of categorizing processes that might be involved in terms of motivation to action. And the first thing we thought about was the possibility that you may not be able to do anything if you're incapable of generating the options for behavior. If it's a beautiful sunny day out there and you're thinking about what you can do, you might be able to come up with several different options. But if you're someone who can't even think of the options, you may seem completely inert. You may not be able to show any evidence of overt action if you can't think of the options for behavior. So one possibility is a loss of the ability to generate options for behavior. Now, to study this, we developed a very simple task. It's akin to fluency tasks that neuropsychologists use, but in this task, we have two circles, one on the top and one at the bottom of a touchscreen. And your job is to generate as many options as you can, and as many paths as you can to link these two. And we'll give you 4 minutes to come up with as many options as you can. And here you can see that one of our participants, it shows you some options which are very direct from one circle to the other. And there are others which are
much more circuitous before they get to the target location. And with a little bit of fancy maths, what we can do is to look at the similarity of each of these paths to each other. And that gives us a measure of the uniqueness, if you like, the creativity between each path, how creative people are in terms of coming up with different types of path. So all we did was ask our participants, draw as many different paths as you can from the bottom red circle to the top red circle in 4 minutes. And what we found here was that the number of options, the number of paths generated, correlated very strongly with a measure of motivation, a self-report measure of motivation. The more motivated you are, the more of these paths you generate in those 4 minutes. Now, interestingly, we also found that the more motivated you are, the less unique these paths are. You're more likely to go directly from one location to another rather than do the circuitous path. So if anything, you're less creative the more motivated you are. But maybe your goal here is to try and get as many of these options off as much in the 4 minutes as you can. So that's interesting. We found that there was a relationship between an independent measure of motivation and the number of options you can generate. But when we looked at Parkinson's disease, because this is a very useful model to study apathy in lots of patients with it, and we can also manipulate whether the patients are on or off the dopaminergic medication, we found that option generation ability was not related to clinical apathy in Parkinson's disease. And in a way, that was a little bit disappointing to begin with because we didn't find anything there, but it was a clear result. It's a clear negative result. It's not because of a lack of ability to generate options for behavior, at least as measured here, that patients with Parkinson's disease have apathy. Interestingly, we did find that being on or off their dopaminergic medication made a difference to the number of paths they generated and also their uniqueness, their creativity. So here is the fluency, the number of options generated by older healthy controls. And this is, you can see that the number of options generated in Parkinson's disease is much less, much fewer. And this can't be explained simply by their problems with motor control. We actually address that issue too and control for it. And you can see that when the patients are put on their medication, the fluency normalizes, but the uniqueness doesn't normalize, it's much reduced. So they're going more straight from one target to the other, but they're making fewer of these circuitous paths when they're on their medication. So dopaminergic medication modulates behavior on this task, it modulates fluency, but it doesn't seem to be related in this task. The number of options generated is not related to apathy. So in our model here, if you are able to generate options for behavior, the next thing to consider is which of these options should I take? Because if I can generate 10 options for what I want to do today, how do I decide which one I'm going to pursue? And this is where many people have thought that this is essentially a neuroeconomic decision. I'm going to have to value the potential rewards, the benefits of pursuing an action against the potential cost of trying to do that. What's the effort going to be like? Is it going to take me a lot of time to do it? Is it a risky option to go for because it may be that I end up with nothing? So all of these things might come into our calculation, our computation, to work out which of these options I'm going to choose. And of course, different people might weigh each of these things differentially. There might be differences in subjective valuation of a particular reward, something that you might value a lot, I might not. So how do we look at this? How do we look at this cost-benefit decision-making? And our inspiration here came from the animal literature, from experiments like this performed by John Salamone. In these studies, he would get a rat into a tea maze and offer it two options. So on the one hand, the rat could obtain bland laboratory chow with very little effort. All he'd have to do is to go along this tea maze and turn right. On the other hand, the rat could be offered something much more rewarding in terms of food that it really likes. But in order to get that food, the rat would have to scale a wall. So the rat would have to scale this wall in order to get the more rewarding outcome. And most rats are willing to do this, but obviously they have different levels of subjective valuation. Some rats are willing to scale higher walls than others. Now, what's been found is if you make lesions either to the homologue of the cingulate cortex in rats, or if you deplete the nucleus accumbens, the ventral striatum, of dopamine, these rats are no longer willing to put in the effort of scaling the wall to get the higher reward item. They'll simply go along and take the lower reward item. So this is a way where we can look at the manner from rat to rat in which they subjectively value a particular reward against the effort required to obtain it. And again, it seems like dopamine is important here. Now, note here that it's not just simply reward we're talking about. We're also talking about how reward might be devalued by the effort required to achieve it, how it might be discounted, in other words, by the effort required to achieve it. And when rats are depleted of dopamine, it seems like a particular reward loses its value if you have to put in an effort to get it. And these kinds of experiments have led to a conceptualization of motivated behavior in terms of two phases. People have considered there might be an instrumental phase, which is really the oomph, the vigor, the motivation to go and put in the energy to approach a rewarding outcome, or perhaps avoid one which might be something unpleasant or punishing. And a consummatory phase of behavior, when the animal is actually consuming the goal. Is it rewarding in some way or another? Now, the interesting thing here is that the instrumental phase, the oomph phase, appears to be dopamine dependent, but the consummatory phase, the hedonic reaction, the pleasure or displeasure, the interaction with the goal, actually appears not to be dependent on dopamine. So although many years ago people considered dopamine to be the reward neurotransmitter in the brain, these studies suggest that dopamine is far more important in modulating the motivation to seek the reward rather than getting the pleasure from the reward itself. Now, those sorts of ideas inspired us to look at the way humans balance potential reward against the effort required to obtain it. So in this study, we asked people on a trial-by-trial basis, if I give you this much reward and you have to put in this much physical effort, are you willing to do that or not? And our way of showing the rewards was on a computer screen. We'd show a number of apples on the tree here, and the number of apples would translate into a monetary reward at the end of the experiment. And we'd show the level of force required by this yellow line on the tree trunk, and that's scaled to your maximum voluntary contraction. So what percentage of your maximum voluntary contraction would be required to obtain this reward? To make that a little bit clearer, here is a cartoon showing you, in this case, there are 5 apples. This is the level of force required. You can decide whether you want to accept that offer or not. If you say no, we'll give you another one. If you say yes, you have to squeeze until you get the force to match the level required. So we have this space of increasing reward and increasing effort, and we can look to see where in that space you'll say yes as shown in the reds, and where you'll say no, as shown in the blues. Okay, so let's have a look how people do this kind of task. So this is a setup. You see on a trial by trial basis an offer. You can either say no, or yes, you can say yes. If you say yes, you have to perform the task. And when we did this in Parkinson's disease and healthy people, what we find is that if people say yes, they do the task. And in fact, they put in a little bit more force than they're required to. You can see here's a dashed line showing the required force. And here you can see the overshoot in terms of the force produced. The other thing that this type of experiment showed us was that patients with Parkinson's disease who are apathetic were no less vigorous in terms of their motor output than patients who are motivated. So the work I'm going to show you in terms of their choices is not dependent on their motor output. Interestingly, when patients were on their dopaminergic medication, they had greater force than when they were not, but they always matched the level that was required. And this is shown here. This is the required effort. This is the squeeze in terms of the proportional maximum voluntary contraction. In healthy controls and Parkinson's disease, the lines are really inseparable. If the patients said they would like to accept the offer, they actually put in the effort that was required to get that reward. So how did they perform overall in terms of their choices? What about this space of reward and effort? So first of all, we're plotting down here the number of, the proportion of offers accepted. Here are healthy controls. Here are Parkinson's patients without apathy and Parkinson's patients with apathy. And you can see that overall, Parkinson's patients with apathy are far less likely to say yes on this task. In fact, if we plot out the proportion of offers accepted against an independent measure of apathy, the Lille apathy rating scale, the more apathetic a patient, the less likely they are to say overall on this task. Interestingly, the proportion of offers accepted was not related to dysphoria. So it appeared to be related to depression, not related to depression or mood, but related to apathy. So if we look at patients with Parkinson's disease who are apathetic compared to patients who aren't apathetic, and we just subtract the difference in their performance, what we find here is if we plot increasing reward and increasing effort, patients with apathy overall are less likely to say yes. They're all below this zero line. They're far less likely to say yes than patients who are not apathetic. But interestingly, the place in this space where they're least likely to say yes is at the lowest levels of reward. Apathetic patients are least incentivized by the lowest rewards on offer. Okay. We also could look at patients when they were on or off their dopaminergic medication, because we wanted to see whether dopamine could modulate the choices in this task. So now what we're plotting is the performance across all patients, apathetic or non-apathetic, when they're on their dopamine medication versus when they're off their dopamine medication. And immediately you'll see that when they're on their dopaminergic medication, they're more likely to say overall yes. But the place where they're more likely to say yes is actually at the highest levels of effort, right? So this is interesting because it looks like the difference between apathy and non-apathy is at the lowest level of reward, whereas the sector of this space where dopamine makes a difference is at the highest levels of effort. And to make that even more transparent, here we're just plotting it on this 2D space, and anything above the line here means that motivated patients accept more offers than apathetic patients. And you can see that's really in this low reward sector. And here, this is the effect of dopamine. That's quite different. Dopamine affects choices on this task, but it does so at a completely different location in this space. So we've got something complex going on here. The task can differentiate between apathetic patients and motivated patients, and it seems to do that in this low reward sector. Dopamine also modulates choices on this task, but it doesn't do it at the same place in terms of this neuroeconomic space. It doesn't do it in the same place that we find a difference between apathetic and non-apathetic patients. And this is one clue to the fact that although Parkinson's disease patients are indeed depleted of dopamine pathologically, and apathetic patients seem to clinically respond to dopamine, then it doesn't mean that dopamine depletion caused their apathy, because as we see in this bit of work, the location where dopamine affects choices is different to the location where apathy affects choices. Just bear that in mind as we go through some of the other work I'm going to show you. So we wanted to use a trans-diagnostic approach to this work. And what we did next was to examine what happens in small vessel disease. And first of all, we looked at patients who have CADASIL. That's an autosomal dominant form which leads to premature small vessel cerebrovascular disease, and many of these patients can develop apathy. We ran the same task in these patients, and what we found was that apathetic patients performed very similarly to the Parkinson's disease patients. The difference between CADASIL patients with apathy and those without apathy was in the low reward space. So the same signature, the same behavioral signature was apparent in this condition, which is a completely different pathology to that in Parkinson's disease. So next, we also looked at patients with sporadic late onset small vessel disease. So this is common garden small vessel disease that might occur with hypertension or smoking or hypercholesterolemia. And we found again that apathetic patients are less willing to accept low reward offers as previously. But in this case, we also found that they were hypersensitive to effort. At the highest levels of effort, they were less willing to accept those as offers as well. So a slight difference here in terms of hypersensitivity effort in the small vessel disease patients who develop this sporadically. Now, in patients with small vessel disease, we can also examine the circuitry because they have changes in the white matter. And functional imaging studies of healthy people have shown us that there are centers that we've talked about before in the basal ganglia and also in ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which are modulated by reward. But there are also other areas in dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and in the insular cortex, which are modulated by effort. So what we can do here is to examine what happens in small vessel disease. So this is our sporadic small vessel disease cohort, and you can see that the white matter tracts, which are abnormal in terms of fractional anisotropy, include parts of the anterior cingulum and the anterior limb of the internal capsule, which conveys fibers from the ventral parts of the basal ganglia to the medial prefrontal cortex. And if we did the same thing in CADASIL, we find again that it's the anterior cingulum and again the anterior limb of the internal capsule, which are implicated. In addition, in this case, we found that orbitofrontal cingulate white matter was also abnormal in the patients with apathy compared to those who aren't. So this provides further evidence that the circuitry which is involved not only in terms of evaluating rewards, but also in terms of considering the effort required to obtain those rewards is affected in these apathetic cases. The final part of the model that I want to discuss today is motivational arousal. So once you've decided on your options, you also have to have some kind of preparatory phase to be aroused to actually perform that action. And you can see that here. This cat is sitting in a garden waiting, and it sees a bird flying down. Look at what happens to its eyes. Those pupils are dilating in anticipation of the rewarding outcome. We can use the same trick in humans. In this case, it's a saccadic task. I get you to look at the center of a screen. A target's going to appear either on the right or the left, and your job is to make a saccade, a fast eye movement, as rapidly as you can to get to the target, because the faster you get there, the bigger the reward I'm going to give you. And when we look at how people fare on this task, on a trial-by-trial basis, if I tell you there's no reward, or there's 10p on offer, or 50p on offer, you can see that the pupil dilates in anticipation of the reward, and it dilates far more the bigger the reward that's on offer. So what happens in patients? Well, if you look at Parkinson's patients who are apathetic, here in cyan, compared to the non-apathetic patients in green, you can see that whilst the non-apathetic patients show this anticipatory pupil dilatation in anticipation of the reward, that's really blunted in patients with apathy. You don't get the same thing if you look at depression. So there's no difference within the same population here if we split the data by those who are depressed and those who aren't. But the interesting thing here is we went on to look at what happens when the patients are on their dopamine medication versus when they're not. And what we found was dopamine increases pupil dilatation on medication compared to off medication, but this occurs in both the apathetic and the non-apathetic patients. So here the data is shown in a different way, off dopamine, on dopamine. You can see the apathetic patients show less reward sensitivity in terms of pupil dilatation compared to the non-apathetic patients. Here are the elderly individuals, but both of them, both sets of patients, improve in terms of reward sensitivity when they're on their dopamine medication. In fact, the curious thing we found was the non-apathetic patients on dopamine actually are hypersensitive to reward. And in a follow-up study where we were looking at patients with Parkinson's who developed impulse control disorder, what we found using the same task is that these patients with impulse control disorder have heightened sensitivity to reward, whether they're on or off their medication, whereas the non-ICD patients actually show increased sensitivity on medication, but this drops off medication. That's an aside. But these findings of dopamine modulating reward sensitivity in both apathetic and non-apathetic patients provides a second piece of evidence to suggest that although dopamine modulates reward sensitivity, dopamine depletion might not necessarily be the cause of apathy in Parkinson's disease. The final bit of evidence I'm going to show you is related to the condition called RBD, REM behavioral sleep disorder, which we know is a very high risk factor for developing Parkinson's disease or Parkinsonian syndromes. So in this study performed by Tom Barber, 45% of patients with REM behavioral sleep disorder were found to be apathetic on a standard instrument. Now, what Tom did next was to look at DAT scanning in these patients, dopamine transporter scanning. And of course, he was interested in the basal ganglia, which you can see lighting up. But in addition, what we also know is that the DAT ligand also targets other monoamine transporters, including the serotonin transporter. And here in the raphe, you can see that can be high signal. But what he found was there was quite a difference between patients in terms of the signal returned from the dorsal raphe. And when we plotted apathy severity in terms of the Lille apathy rating scale and this uptake in the dorsal raphe, we found a very strong correlation. The more apathetic the less the signal in the dorsal raphe. And this suggests that serotonin might also play an important role in the development of apathy in at least patients with RBD who go on to develop Parkinsonism. So I've covered a lot of territory here. Let me summarize. Apathy is a common syndrome across brain disorders, and a lot of evidence, some of which I've shown you today, suggests that there's dysfunction of ventral striatal medial frontal systems. And this provides a potential systems level target for therapy. For example, we might think about deep brain stimulation for apathy. One component of the apathetic process seems to be an abnormal ability, an abnormal weighting of reward and effort, abnormal effort-based decision-making for rewards. And we've looked to see how apathetic patients are particularly less inclined to accept low reward offers. But although dopamine alters behavior, as I've said, there are lines of evidence to suggest that dopamine depletion itself may not necessarily be the cause of apathy, at least in Parkinson's disease. Dopamine, we've seen, can be important in terms of reward sensitivity, can modulate reward sensitivity, but it does so in both apathetic and non-apathetic cases. So I think there's a lot to do here. It's an important condition, poorly studied, and I hope you agree with me, it's fascinating in terms of trying to understand not only why patients become apathetic, but whether similar principles might also be applicable to healthy people. Thank you.